Okay, we're ready to work an increase round now. Mary's already knitted a few rounds on the sock, including a couple of increase rounds, and she's ready to work another increase round. So we're going to show you how to do the increases on the Tess stranded slippers. And she's just informed me that she needs to trap in the yarn, the contrast yarn, that the float's getting too long and she thinks it needs to be trapped in. So we're just going to do that on this first stitch before increasing into the first stitch. So let's do that first, Mary. You knit the first stitch and she takes the point of the needle, her working needle, underneath the contrast colour yarn that's been held in her left hand for knitting continental method, and then wrap the main colour yarn around it to make the stitch, and pull that back underneath the contrast colour yarn and into the stitch, and then make the stitch as usual. And so that's trapped that yarn in now. It's carried over the main colour yarn as it emerges from that stitch. And now she's ready to work the first increase. She's knitted the first stitch on this needle. All the increases in the Tess slippers are knitted after the first stitch and before the last stitch in each half of the round. So that's 2 increases on the top of the toe and 2 increases on the sole of the foot in each round. So the increases are lifted increases, they're not bar increases, so they're not used using strands between stitches, but they are knitted into actual stitches. She's going to knit into the stitch which is 2 stitches below the stitch on the needle. So you can see clearly there's a stitch below the one that she's only just made, and then there's a stitch below that. Now there's 2 ways of doing this. She could go down behind that first stitch below the needle and pick up the purl bump of the stitch below it. That's the second purl bump below the needle. Or, and this is the way that Mary's going to do it, she can just pick up the side of that stitch 2 stitches below the stitch on the needle, the very edge strand of it. That's the left hand strand because she's a right-handed knitter, and she's lifted that strand up onto her passive needle and is now ready to knit it, and she's going to knit it through the back loop. And that's the very first increase. And now she's going to knit across all the other stitches on the needle in the stranded pattern as set until she reaches the last stitch. Now that first increase, the one that she's just knitted, I call that a lifted increase after, because it's a lifted increase into a stitch column after knitting the stitch at the top of the column. That's when it's worked, so it's called a lifted increase after. And then the next increase is knitted into the stitch column of the last stitch in this half of the round on the needle, and it's knitted increased into the stitch before knitting it, so we call it a lifted increase before. And Mary's just working her way along, and there she is, she's reached it. Now the first increase we did was into the stitch 2 stitches below the stitch that had just been knitted. A lifted increase below is into the stitch immediately below the stitch on the passive needle. So she could go behind that stitch and just lift up the purl bump from below with her working needle, but Mary doesn't do it that way. She likes to pick up the very edge of the stitch, so she's going to pick up the right hand side of that stitch below the one on the needle, and she lifts it onto the needle and then knits it in the normal way through the front loop, through the front leg, and then knits the stitch itself. So that's how the increases are done. There are 2 in each half of the round, 1 after the first stitch and 1 before the last stitch in each half of the round. So that means that there are 4 increases in each increase round of the Tess slippers. Thank you very much.